Hello. This is a one-off talk and something a little bit different. I thought vaguely that I might do something on this topic at some point in the future, but then trying to fit in time to make these films and get them posted in time, suddenly realised, looked at the calendar and thought, well, we've got Easter coming up next weekend. This will be posted a few days before that. Hopefully. The camera's misbehaving so far this morning, but assuming that I can get it to work again and can get this completed, then that'll be the idea. And there's a fair chance there'll be all the biblical epics will turn up on television. You'll get the likes of Ben-Hur and the Robe and the various other ones that depict Roman soldiers in them. And they depict Roman soldiers very much as the filmmakers at the time thought they should look, but also this is based on how the audience would recognise them as what they're meant to be. These are Roman soldiers. And of course you could go back in art and look at various paintings of the crucifixion and other moments around the Easter weekend where, again, Roman soldiers will feature, and they've very often been depicted in sort of Renaissance-style armour or imaginings of how the Roman troops may have looked. So it is one of those cases where lots of people who aren't necessarily that interested in the ancient world get confronted with the image of the Roman soldier. They have to know who that is. Even in the modern films where they've claimed there's been more attempt at accuracy, these tend to be depicted as Roman legionaries, or at least as the filmmakers consider Roman legionaries should look. And that's fairly typical of the general attitude towards the Roman army. Basically, the legions are the Roman army, which is at the very best a half-truth, because things are a lot more complicated than that at every period. So I thought we'd talk about just who were the Roman troops in Judea in the 1st century AD up until AD 66, when you have the big rebellion against Nero that will lead to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, that will lead to Judea becoming a rather more prestigious, important province, and finally then it gets a legionary garrison. Because one of the few things we can say with reasonable confidence is that the chances of there being legionaries in Jerusalem in the 30s AD, and indeed either side of that, was remarkably slim, and the probability is that they simply weren't there, and that you had other Roman soldiers that were nevertheless part of the regular Roman army. So that's the idea of today's talk, just who were the Roman troops in Judea in this period? What was the garrison of Judea? What was it for? Where was it recruited? What did these soldiers look like as far as we can tell? I put Pontius Pilate's Bodyguard in the title because there was an old joke in the British Army that the 1st Regiment of Foot, the Royal Scots, the senior regiment of the line of the British Army, were so old that they'd been Pontius Pilate's bodyguard. So this is trying to look at the reality of that rather than the nickname that I think goes back at least to the 18th century, and it's certainly Victorian. So Pontius Pilate was the governor of the province of Judea, and we'll come back to his status a little bit later. There won't be time today to go into all the evidence we have for his tenure of office, which seems to have been exceptionally long, at roughly 10 years in the job, because that leads to all sorts of other issues which are quite interesting, and in that they explain how Roman government, Roman officials tried to interact with local communities and deal with problems, and just what the Roman state wanted and what it felt it was forced to do in these circumstances. But that's quite a big issue. Let's focus on the army today. So we better begin with some general statements, and while this may be all old hat to many of the folk who've been kind enough to watch others of these videos so far, if anybody's coming to this fresh, if anybody's just curious, say, who were the Roman soldiers in Jerusalem in the 30s AD, then we better begin with the very basics. The Roman army became a professional permanent force under Caesar Augustus, so at the end of the 1st century BC, early 1st century AD. And Augustus established 28 Roman legions. Now, a legion was the old traditional Roman citizens serving under arms, the oldest part of the Roman army. Originally the word had just meant levy, but it had become a distinct unit in its own right. And they were quite big units. Roughly about 5,000 strong, at least that's, the theory. Military units in reality tend to be rather messier and are rarely at their full theoretical paper strength, for want of a better term. So about 5,000 men, commanded by a senator in his early 30s, and divided up into 10 cohorts, most of the time were supposed to be about 480 strong. They'd have 6 centurions in charge of the 6 80-man centuries, or subunits, companies almost, by modern standards, within each cohort. So that was the Legion. It was designed to be a force for fighting quite big battles, large-scale warfare, because it had that command structure, like a modern brigade or small division, grouping everybody together, and people in charge, they're used to working together as a team. Now, there were 28 of these under Augustus until in 89, 3 of them were destroyed, and for a while there were 25. By the end of the 1st century AD, it creeps up to 30 again. Around about the sort of 100 AD, a new legion was formed and was given the number 30 by the Emperor Trajan, which suggests that that's the total. Now, legions are big units. They have their number, they have their name. The sequence wasn't logical. There were several third legions, for instance, and other numbers were duplicated as well, and other numbers were skipped. The 17th, 18th, and 19th, the legions that were destroyed in AD 9, those numbers were never revived. So you have to deal with unit pride, unit tradition, corporate identity within this. It's not an entirely logical system. When Augustus put together this permanent army, he wasn't starting from a completely clean slate. There had been armies on various sides in the civil wars up until then, and units that wanted to keep their identity. But the legions are quite big units of 5,000, and in the period we're talking about, there are 25 to 28, depending on which specific year you look at. As I say, by the end of the century, you've gone up to 30. Assuming that they've got their 5,000 men they're supposed to have, then that gives a total legionary strength of about 150,000 in AD 100. But that's only a part of the Roman army, and there were at least as many other soldiers who weren't legionaries. And the primary distinction between the two was that the Roman legionaries were Roman citizens. In a few cases, men were given citizenship when they enlisted, but the idea was you were supposed to be a citizen of Rome before you could join the army. So they were more prestigious. They had certain rights, certain honours. They were aided by the auxilia, and the roots of the word come in, auxiliary, and in a sense of helping, aiding, supporting. Roman armies had always relied a lot on allies, and at virtually every period of Roman history you look at least 50% of the men in any Roman army were not Roman citizens. They were allies, they were occasionally mercenaries and others, but they were increasingly regular professional soldiers serving under Roman officers, at least at the highest level, who were enlisted in the Roman army, and as the 1st century AD progressed, their rights became more crystallized and they became entitled to Roman citizenship at the end of their term of service. Now, given that the term of service was for 25 years, that wasn't something everybody was going to live long enough to gain, but nevertheless, that was a significant honor. It gave you greatly enhanced legal status, and it meant, for instance, that your son, who would be a citizen, could go off and join the Roman legions if he wanted to, go directly into a legion rather than an auxiliary unit. Now, auxiliary units provided at least half the manpower of the Roman army, and probably over time there was a steady increase because they were a little bit cheaper and they were easier for the emperor to move around and shift. And it was also a very good way of keeping otherwise unemployed, disgruntled young males within your provinces doing something useful for the state rather than thinking about rebellion, banditry, or, do we actually like being ruled by these Romans? So let's see what we can do about that. So there were lots of practical benefits to it as well. The auxiliaries were organized differently to the legions in that there was no unit of the same sort of size as a legion of 5,000 men. Instead, the auxiliaries were in independent cohorts, in the case of the infantry, or a unit called an ala. It goes back to the wing, it meant originally, because they tended to be positioned on the flanks, of cavalry. And most of these were around about the 480, 500 man mark, so about the same size as the equivalent in the legions, and a small proportion of them were what were known as miliary, which means literally 1,000 strong, but just like century didn't actually mean 100 men under command of a centurion, more like 80. Miliary units tended to be about 800. And there were this division between infantry and cavalry, but there were also some infantry units that had attached cavalry detachments with them on a permanent basis, usually at about a ratio of 4 infantrymen to 1 cavalryman. At some point I'll do other videos about the auxilia and their organisation and how we can reconstruct it, but for the moment that's what we need to know. The auxiliaries are the non-citizens. They're half the army, and they're organised at a smaller level. They don't have the big building blocks like the legions. And there's some evidence that they lack some of the technical capacity and engineering skill, use of artillery, this sort of thing. Although, again, one of the things we'll talk about today is slightly more complicated than that, as is nearly always the case with the Roman army. So you have your Roman legionary. Now, he is the man who is associated very much in some Roman art and in the popular imagination with the soldiers who wear the segmented, the banded armour, have the big rectangular curved shields, and carry the pilum, this distinctively Roman heavy throwing javelin that the idea was it put all the weight behind a small point to punch through a shield and drive on through the shield into the body of the man behind it. There is no direct evidence for auxiliaries ever being issued with segmented armour, though a few people claim that maybe it was, and never say never. There's no evidence at all for them being given the pilum, and little really for the rectangular shield. So auxiliaries on nice Roman monuments like Trajan's Column are depicted as very different in appearance from the legionaries. They've got oval shields, they wear mail armour, they've got simpler helmets, and they carry spears, javelins rather than the pilum. That's probably over stylized, but nevertheless it's been reinforced. The reenactment groups like the Ermine Street Guard, they maintain a distinct, this is the legionary, this is an auxiliary, and it's a good way of explaining how the Roman army worked, because there's a fair bit of truth in it. The probability is in such a large institution as the Roman army, if you've got 150,000 legionaries, as many auxiliaries, perhaps more, plus some people in the fleet, you're talking of an army of 300,000 plus, 350,000 maybe, over centuries. Then the odds are that some peculiarities turned up, that sometimes people had kit that they weren't necessarily supposed to have or wouldn't normally have, or it was decided for the particular job they were doing this was a useful thing. But the distinction remained, and it was a very important legal distinction. Auxilia are not citizens, legionaries are Roman citizens. And they look different, and they're perceived as different, and they're organised into different sized units. Although a legionary cohort and auxiliary cohort were sort of equivalent in size and probably in role, there isn't anything equivalent to an auxiliary legion. There's also a level of prestige because of the size of these formations. A legion was commanded by a senator in his early 30s, so that's somebody from the top council of the Roman state. There are about 600 senators at any one time, and one of these men is going out to command a legion, except for the legions in Egypt, but we won't worry about Egypt today because that's just an extra complication. Auxiliaries are commanded by men from the next social class down. Beneath the Senate you have the Equestrian order, knights. They go back to the days when they'd originally been the cavalry of the earlier Roman army, when it was very much the Roman people called up to defend the state whenever it was felt necessary. There are tens of thousands of equestrians at the very least, and one thing Augustus has done and his successors is give them a career path. And a major part of this, as service to the state, is commanding auxiliary units. And the pattern that will be established is that you go off and you command an infantry cohort first. You then go to be a junior tribune in a legion for a few years, so you're getting experience of that role of that side of the army as well, and that different staff roles of doing jobs in a bigger formation. And then you come back to be let loose on a cavalry ala. Because cavalry with their horses are a lot more expensive. They're easier for somebody to mess up and run down into a bad state, and they're very expensive if someone goes off and gets lots of them killed. So the cavalry were the prestige units, and the military cavalry units in particular, that was the peak of a man's career in terms of unit commands. So these fellows are equestrians. These are, as I say, people of importance, but they're not senators. They're not from the very pinnacle of Roman society. They're from one step down, which doesn't mean that many of them were not very wealthy, significant, well-educated individuals. So you have the auxiliaries, and they're non-citizens, and they're recruited from all over the empire, and in some cases you get men drawn from outside as well. They'll be willing to come in and take the oath to the emperor and serve their 25 years. So you have cohorts from Gaul, you have them from Syria, eventually from places like Britain, and they'll be given, their distinction will be the legions will have a number and usually a name.
Second Augusta Legion, 10th Fretensis, 10th the Thunderers, the Thunderbolts, something like that, 14th Gemina, the Twins, a legion that's been formed by amalgamating two others. So it's come together. And auxiliary units tend to have an ethnic name associated with them. They get a number, and then they are the second cohort of Britons or the first Ala of Thracians or whatever it might be. Virtually every population within the empire contributes to the auxilia of the Roman Empire. So virtually everybody can join. There are some cases of conscription where it's part of your tax obligation. You supply men to fight in the auxiliaries in the Roman army. One of the main exceptions to this is Judea, where the Jewish population is not obliged to perform military service. And as an aside, that's something of a change from earlier periods when there'd been a lot of Jewish allies and mercenaries serving with various kings and states around the wider world. And they had fought and considered to be particularly useful and good soldiers. So that's part of the origins of some of the Jewish communities in Egypt, but also elsewhere. There seems to have been a sense that society and religion, as it was interpreted in this period, meant that there were too many taboos within military service that a proper Jew couldn't perform, and therefore would not be willing to serve in the Roman army. So it was a privilege, but it was also to some extent a disadvantage, because becoming an officer in the auxiliaries was quite an important stepping stone socially for the local elites, the aristocracy of the different regions. Because if you got sufficient property qualification to be registered as an equestrian, if you'd become a Roman citizen, which was something that was available, you could end up following one of these public careers. You could command auxiliary units and perhaps go further, because there were other equestrian posts beyond that. So non-participation by the Jewish population on the one hand means you're not removing your sort of males with not so much to do and bored at home and want some excitement, sending them off to the army where they can go off and be exhausted and go and fight the empire's foes. They're staying at home. And that means, well, you've got lots of capable people who have time on their hands, but also it's very much for the elite. They don't have a pathway into the mainstream, wider imperial elite of the Roman system, of the Roman Empire, through military service, through service perhaps as centurions, junior officers in the auxilia, and then as equestrians, having gained citizenship, having gained equestrian status. So that's quite an important difference. It's something that doesn't really apply elsewhere. Now, although auxiliary units tend to be formed originally as Gauls, Spaniards, Thracians, Syrians, North Africans, usually with a tribal name, a provincial name, depending on the way the population is organised in each region, and given a number, these units stay in existence for a long time. Almost as long as many of the legions. Some of the legions will stay in existence for centuries. There are a few that are around in the first century that are still mentioned in around about 400 in a document listing offices within the Roman Empire and the administration of the empire at that time, and some perhaps even further. So these are old institutions in the same way that armies like the British Army, where you have the regimental tradition, there are units like the Royal Scots that are now part of the Royal Regiment of Scotland or whatever it's called. I'll check that before I post this and put it in the comments. I can't remember. There have been so many amalgamations and mergings of units and military reforms just in my lifetime that the army I was told about when I was in the OTC at Oxford is not the same as the army now in terms of the number of units. But same sort of things happening in the Roman army. There'll be mergers, there'll be changes, but aspects of tradition do appear to be kept up. And that sense of we are special because we are Legio Second Augusta or 10th Fretensis, and therefore it's expected of us to fight better, to perform better, and we don't like all the other legions in the Roman army, and we'll bicker with them given the opportunity. And there's a rivalry that's more or less friendly and not always that friendly between all units, but some in particular. That's going on in the Roman army. And one big change that occurs is that, as far as we can tell, there is little or no effort to keep on recruiting men from the same ethnic group that formed the original ranks of the unit. So you don't, if you post a Gallic unit out to Syria and it stays there for generations, you don't bother to send recruiting parties all the way back to Gaul and lug the recruits back out to Syria. You instead go to the nearest source of suitable recruits for the Roman army and you hire them instead and you sign them up. So it's quite clear that in many units you have a large number of people who have no connection at all with the ethnic identity. And of course the army works in Latin, and to a slightly lesser extent in the eastern provinces many aspects of day-to-day routine will be done in Greek, and certainly a lot of the communication, that's the main sort of international language that everybody's using. Commands are still in Latin, administration is Latin, record keeping is Latin, and once you're in the system, it doesn't matter what language you spoke originally. Now, Arrian in the 2nd century AD talks about the Emperor Hadrian being very wise in allowing units to keep their distinctive battle cries and the like. Again, there's probably be variations in that there might be aspects of the culture of the original people who formed the unit that will continue. There might also be other things added in because of particular events, particularly distinguished moments of that particular cohort, that particular ala. But on the whole, after the first generation of recruits, unless a unit stays reasonably close to its place of origin, then there doesn't seem to be a lot of effort to recruit people from the same group. So the idea that you have a unit of Germans, of Gauls, of Thracians, of Syrians, might not mean that any of the men within it are actually from those areas. Less clear with the officers. Again, you'd expect the same pattern, that essentially you're bringing in officers from anywhere over the empire, whether as centurions or elsewhere. We don't know as much about auxiliary centurions as we would like. Most of the information about this class of officer comes from the Roman legions, so that's rather different. So, auxiliaries are rather different. There are a lot more of them. There are far more units, independent units, because whereas you'd have 10 cohorts are all part of one legion and you tend to move the whole legion around from station to station, you'd have 10 independent auxiliary units for the equivalent number of soldiers, and it's much easier for an emperor to say, right, well, we'll shift a couple here, we'll move them there. Moving a legion becomes a major thing. There are provinces that contain 3 or 4 at this period, others that contain just 1. It's dangerous because these are politically useful in that your senators are also your potential rivals as an emperor. So you have to be a little bit careful about giving anybody as governor command of an army that might allow them to get ideas, rebel against you, try and become emperor. This will be shown very clearly when Nero commits suicide in 68 and you get 3 other emperors, followed by a 4th in just over 12 months, as the provincial armies proclaim their own man as leader and then fight for who's going to win, who's actually going to be the emperor. Auxiliary units don't have that same potential. They don't have as much pay concentrated in their coffers, in their official treasury, which you have in every auxiliary base. Because again, Roman soldiers are paid in hard coins. There's a lot of money coming through. Soldiers are also allowed to save, which is organised by the army. So there can be quite a lot of money stored in one place in army bases, which is another wonderful thing. If you're plotting rebellion, you can persuade the army to change sides. So on the whole, an emperor is quite cautious before he moves legions around and shifts them, because it affects the whole balance of power and the risks he faces. Is he giving too much military force to one man as governor? It also attracts more attention. The legions are famous, there aren't so many of them, they're Roman citizens, so there is that tradition that people take more interest of the influential classes at Rome itself to know where the legions are. It's also, of course, the senators go out to legions as a tribune in their late teens, as commander of a legion in their 30s, and then commander of a province in their 40s that will hopefully for them include command of 1 or more legions. All of these are prestigious posts, therefore the Senate keeps an eye on what's available. They don't want the emperor to be too restrictive on their chances for glory, for military success. So, auxiliaries, by contrast, they're only commanded by equestrians. There are lots more of them. They're less famous. You can shift them around. You can raise new units. You can disband them rather more easily than you can with the legions. So they're a very useful force. And they're commanded by a man usually with the title of Prefect, who is, as I mentioned before, an Equestrian. Some of the more prestigious units have a commander who's called a Tribune instead, but it's essentially the same job with slightly more prestige about it. It is possible for a freed slave to become an Equestrian in a way that it's not to become a senator. You have to be at least one generation removed from that. It's very rare, but it becomes more common in Claudius's day. There are several imperial freedmen that are highly favoured, and the fact that they may well be efficient and useful as sort of senior ministers or secretaries doesn't stop the Senate from deeply resenting the fact that the emperor is listening to the opinions of former slaves. So, for instance, you get Felix, who will govern Judea later on, who appears in the book of Acts. He's the brother of one of Claudius's most important freedmen, and Felix goes on, he marries a couple of royal women, he has a very distinguished career, even though most of the sources are fairly hostile to him, partly because he's a former slave, but of course you never know. That doesn't mean just because you've come up the hard way doesn't necessarily mean you are actually nice and honest, but it's very hard to tell. You also get the Claudius Lysias, who appears in Acts in the rest of Paul in Jerusalem. Seems to have been a tribune, judging from the escort that's given, that suggests that the unit in Jerusalem then is one of these mixed cohorts of infantry and cavalry, a cohort equitata, and probably a miliary one. Therefore, that's the sort of prestige unit that warrants a tribune in charge. But again, it's a sign of the sort of slightly less prestigious status of equestrian officers and unit commanders. Now, the big provinces of the empire are commanded by senators. Change under Augustus is that they go out to the military provinces as his legatus, his representative, rather than as a proconsul in their own right. That's a change from the Republican days when, again, it led to civil war when too many senators had command of armies in their own right. And it's part of the change in the way the empire is organised under Augustus. The Roman Republic has had lots of provinces, it's had an empire, but until it gets its first emperor, a lot of things aren't systemised in quite the same way. So Augustus carries out major reforms over the course of several decades, creates this system where virtually all of the legions and the vast majority of army units in general are concentrated in provinces where the man in charge has been somebody he has appointed and whose authority is delegated. Everybody in the Roman army takes an oath of loyalty to the emperor, and their pay, their promotions, everything like that comes in the emperor's name. Whether or not he ever actually sees them or knows of their existence doesn't matter. They are the emperor's soldiers as well as the soldiers of Rome. Augustus has some of the less militarily significant provinces commanded by senators who do go out as proconsuls and the like. Very occasionally they have small numbers of troops at their disposal, but these are always auxiliaries or detached legionaries. They never have an entire legion, with the exception of North Africa early on, and that will eventually change. It's one of those sort of, with all of these things, there are usually a few anomalies to start off with, but the overall pattern is that anywhere that has a legion is commanded by a senator who's there as Augustus is, or whichever the emperor may be, his representative with delegated authority. Egypt is different. That is kept as the private property province of the emperor, and is ruled in worked and administered in a different way, and the legions there are different. But that's another quite complicated issue. Then there are minor provinces, and these are really an innovation of Augustus. Up until Augustus, there was never a province that wasn't commanded by a senator. A Roman governor is appointed by the Senate, and he is a member of that body. And Augustus continues that for all of the important ones, but for a few very small areas, and Egypt, which again is different, you send out an equestrian governor. And these are normally titled prefects. So if we look at this inscription from Caesarea Maritima on the coast there of modern-day Israel, it's the only physical evidence for Pontius Pilate's presence in Judea, or indeed for his life. There are literary mentions of him, but we don't have any other physical evidence. That's not at all unusual for anybody. There are many senators who are not recorded on any inscription. There are even more equestrians who never appear anywhere. I've talked about this in other videos and elsewhere, but the characters who appear in the Vindelander writing tablets, the equestrian officers there, and their wives, who are all equestrians, they never appear anywhere else. We wouldn't have known of their existence as individuals until that particular source turned up. Again, there are tens of thousands at the very least of equestrians at any one time. You can't expect each one to have set up a big inscription somewhere or a bronze plaque or something like that that has managed to survive through the ages. So it isn't that unusual. If you look at the inscription, it's not terribly high quality. I mean, it's okay, the lettering's neat, but there's a lot of what we call ligaturing, where the person hasn't calculated properly and they're adding letters in onto the top of other letters, just sort of cram in the words they need. It's fragmentary. It records the construction of a Tiberium to the imperial cult, so a building that's honouring the Emperor Tiberius, who's a pretty neurotic, suspicious fellow at this stage in his life, so it's no surprise he's doing this, and the divine Augustus and Livia. And we know of temples of the imperial cult in Caesarea. But it mentions, you can see it's fragmentary. The first part of the word is gone, but you can see that it was Praefectus of Judea. So the rank of Pontius Pilate and the other governors up until around about 40-ish AD was Prefect, Praefectus. After that, they seem to be called Procurator. It's essentially the same post, somebody doing the same job. Whether there's slight differences in pay or prestige, or whether it's just to emphasize the difference between the procurator commanding the province and the prefects in charge of individual auxiliary units. But that's the status. Pilate is presumably someone who's come through commanding individual units and been favoured enough to be granted this province. We don't know anything about him. Other than this, we don't know anything about his background, why he was selected, his prior career up until this point. The only things that are known about him are during his tenure in Judea, and you get them from Josephus, and Tacitus mentions some bits. And there's bits and bobs in a few of the sources, as well as, of course, the New Testament mentions. But not a lot is known about him, but again, that's not unusual at all. It's actually a surprise when we do know a bit about anybody, particularly at this level, and frankly there are plenty of senatorial governors that are either unknown or we don't know anything about their career, unless they happen to have set up an inscription that tells us, or unless one of the sources throws it in, we just assume they've followed what we consider to be the normal pattern. So this is Pilate. He's in charge of a province that is not a prestigious unit of the Roman Empire. It is not considered to be a province facing a major military problem, whether of internal resistance or of external threat. So it isn't Syria. It isn't the German provinces on the Rhine, the Pannonia, Moesia, places like that on the Danube, Britain after AD 43 that will require a very large garrison where there is fairly frequent warfare. This is a minor thing. It's somewhere not considered important enough for a senator, and it's an innovation of Augustus and his successors to use equestrians in this way for these little small areas that present a rather knotty problem. So Judea isn't very high prestige, and it's not got a senator in charge. And one of the consequences of this is that it doesn't have a legionary garrison. Now, basically this is because, other than in Egypt, you couldn't have an equestrian in charge of the province with a senator who is senior to him socially and in every other respect in charge of a legion under his command. So there's a basic anomaly there. You can't have a legion in a province governed by an equestrian unless it's Egypt, where the legions are commanded by equestrians. But again, Egypt is peculiar all the time because it's such an important grain supplier, source of wealth for the emperor, that he doesn't trust anybody else to control it. And other senators are not even allowed to visit Egypt without permission. So that's a different area. Judea isn't important in that respect, and for a lot of the time has been governed for the Romans by client rulers. Obviously, you've got the Herod family, who Herod the Great's the famous one, but the whole succession of Herod Agrippa I and II, various other dynasts from this extended family that's in Herod's day had done its very best to annihilate itself, but hadn't quite managed. They turn up governing parts or all of the region. And, at the Pontius Pilate's day, Galilee in that area is under one of the Herods. It's fairly common within the Roman Empire, particularly in the eastern provinces, where you have many of these established states already, although various Roman governors will play fast, and emperors will play fast and loose with appointing dynasts to regions where they don't have any particular connections, so they can turn up almost anywhere and be given this and say, you administer that. It's the idea that someone who is local in a broad sense might manage the job better, might be more stable. It means the Romans don't have to worry about appointing governors on a regular basis, finding people they can trust. It means that they have a limited military commitment. Somebody else can do the job for them. Maybe they'll do it better, and we won't look too closely about what you're actually up to. It's fairly common. It's this Roman idea that as far as possible they don't want to run the empire. They would prefer the locals to administer themselves. Therefore, most cities keep their own administration, their own laws, and it's only when these come into conflict with Roman citizens or with another community with its own sort of basically self-administering system, or administered system rather, its own laws, that the Romans come in to arbitrate. Or the Romans come in because somebody within the city feels they're being done down by their rivals and it's not fair, and therefore appeal to the emperor. So it is part of this, as far as possible, let's stand back from the day-to-day running of the communities of the empire and let them get on with it. Judea, because it faces this series of problems in that you have divisions within the Jewish community, you have other communities like the Samaritans, you have Gentile communities and cities. There are lots of different groups that are frequently rivals, frequently coming into conflict. And this is the pattern to the background, really, to the build-up to the big rebellion in 66. And the outbreaks of violence, the problems with insurgency, banditry, the less days of Josephus, the bandits, the rebels. Again, a lot of these things depend on your point of view. That make this a volatile area. So the area causes problems, and at times the Roman response has been, well, let's appoint a local king. He can sort it out for us. But when that doesn't work, then they've removed that particular king, and they've reluctantly committed some arms of the Roman state to do it, but they're doing it in a small way. And Judea does sort of come in and out of direct Roman rule at various times that will eventually end up as a province. So this is a low prestige province, but it's a province that does require some military presence, some problem. Now, the relationship between the big senatorial military province of Syria and the small equestrian province of Judea is complicated, and it might be that scholars are, chasing the wind, trying to find a neat, clear definition of how this worked. There are times when Roman governors of Syria intervene in Judea, and there are plenty of other times where they are called upon to intervene by leaders within Judea. For instance, Pilate is eventually dismissed because, or at least recalled to Rome for investigation, because of complaints from Jewish aristocrats about him that have gone to the Syrian governor and complained to him because he's a senator, and if he takes notice, he'll tell the emperor, and then the emperor might do something. The Roman system works like that. If you don't get the answer you want from the most immediate source of Roman authority, then you go higher up and you can go to the emperor ultimately. Whether he'll listen, how long it will take for him to listen, whether he'll then decide in your favour is another matter, but you have that route open to you, and the wealthier you are, the more you're part of the imperial elite, the easier this path is to follow. It looks as if, broadly speaking, the units that are in Judea are administered by the Syrian army, at least to some extent. They're included within it in certain documents, at least later on. But it's a little bit messy, it's a little bit unclear. On a day-to-day basis, the Prefectus, somebody like Pontius Pilate and his successors, they do appear to have had freedom of action, as far as any Roman governor had. They are the emperor's representative. There isn't time to go and ask, what should I do in each situation? Therefore, they have to make snap decisions on the spot, and then they have the military force to back it up and impose their will on others. So what is that military force? It's, as I say, it's not a legion. There is never a legion in Judea before 66, other than in periods of major expeditions when there's been some insurgency or problem. So, 4 BC, after the death of Herod the Great, governor of Syria marches in. AD 6, the disturbances over the census, governor of Syria marches in. In the late 30s, early 40s, 41, when Caligula wanted his own statue and images put up in the temple in Jerusalem, and there's a big protest, the governor of Syria marches in, but in fact handles the matter far more sensitively than we tend to expect for Roman governors. So, governor of Syria can intervene and is senior to the prefect, later procurator in Judea, but he's not permanently day to day telling him what to do. And it isn't a clear hierarchy that, the governor of Judea reports to the governor of Syria. He does seem to report directly to Rome. It's just that you can circumvent him and go to Syria. And if the governor of Syria feels that there is a problem developing in Judea that the prefect procurator isn't dealing with very well, then he may intervene without seeking a permission first, or he certainly might approach the emperor. So there's an element of ambiguity about all of this. But what is clear is that there is no legion in Judea, and there is no good evidence for legionary detachments serving in Judea. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but the probability is that any soldier who appears in Judea in this period is an auxiliary. So who were they? How much do we know about the units that were actually forming the garrison of Judea? It's let's see. So it's created as a province after the death of Herod the Great, and then at times bits of it go back into to rule by various dynasts. There's a fair chance that Herod the Great's army, that was modelled around the sort of the Roman ideal, the Roman system, units from that were taken directly into the Roman auxilia when it became a Roman province. And this is a pattern that you'll see repeatedly, where units organised for one of the client rulers, again modelled on the auxiliary structure, so they're already in cohorts, they've already got centurions in each century, they've got a prefect or equivalent in charge, they're presumably using the same tactics, drill, equipment, at least a reasonably close version of them, so that they are very Roman-like, and then they can become part of the Roman army. And occasionally, as we'll see, there's some evidence of units that have been Roman then being almost loaned back to a client king when a new one is appointed, and then later on becoming Roman, fully part of the Roman army again. So, for most of the period from 4 BC to AD 66, when there is a Roman province of Judea, then looks as if the garrison consists of an ala of cavalry, and this is probably ala 1 Sebastenorum. Later miliaria, later becomes double strength. That probably doesn't happen till near the end of the 1st century AD. It's attested a little bit after this, in a later period. Again, many Roman army units have a very long life, or at least their name, their title, their identity. So this is, there isn't evidence for it in terms of tombstones of individual soldiers, records of individual soldiers in the period we're looking at, but this seems to be the ala of Sebasteni that's mentioned by Josephus and others, the cavalry unit. This is it, and it's called ala 1 because, as far as we can see, there is only ever one of them. But all auxiliary units get a number, or at least after the early phases, you're called even if there is just one of you, you do get that numeral, because they never know, they might raise some more. There seem to be 5 cohorts of infantry as well, including at least one of Sebasteni. So this is cohorts 1, Sebastina, again miliaria. Miliaria doesn't really come in until later on, again it's a late 1st century thing. And this is attested on diplomas of the Syrian army. Now these diplomas are bronze plaques that are copies of a document giving Roman citizenship to a discharged auxiliary soldier who's been honourably discharged at the end of his service. So after his 25 years, he becomes a Roman citizen, and depending on the era, he gets citizenship for one wife and the children with that wife as well. And these documents will usually list all the units within the army of that province that were discharging men at the same time. So it gives you, it's one of those indications. They're a valuable source in that they often tell us which units were in a particular province at a time, and differences between diplomas from the same area sometimes tell us, well, that unit seems to have been posted away. Although just possibly you would get occasions where there was nobody due for discharge in that year. And that would be particularly true in the initial life of a unit before anybody's served their 25 years or got close to it. But also at other times where you've had heavy recruitment at one period and then there are slow years when there's nobody coming up for their demob. It used to be thought that the other cohorts were all Sebasteni as well. Some of them may have been, and there may just have been one or two other cohorts. It's a little bit unclear. There are at least 5 cohorts of infantry and this one ala of cavalry. There might be one or two more cohorts at any particular time, because we'll come on to a couple of other named units that are not Sebasteni as far as we can tell. Now, Sebaste, it's the Greek form of Augustus, and Herod had founded a city in Samaria and given it the name Sebaste. There's more than one, there are others elsewhere, but that seems to be the one that gives the name to these particular units. And so they are formed, organised and named after Samaria and that area, or particularly this community that was at least in part a Gentile community, plonked down in the area. And Herod, of course, his army recruited widely from the non-Jewish population, and apart from there were some Gauls and Germans that Mark Antony had given to Cleopatra as a bodyguard, and that then after their defeat Augustus gives to Herod the Great. There are Thracians and others mentioned. There seem to be several units that perhaps have been loaned to him by the Romans, or he's been allowed to recruit Roman or part Roman trained troops, and these have been settled in veteran colonies in the area, so some of the next generation are coming through. There probably are some Samaritans within these units. There's a fair chance to say that the officers in particular may well have been local bigwigs, locally influential, and some of these will have been Samaritans who bought into the Roman system. We know rather less about the population of Samaria than, of course, the Jewish population, because it doesn't leave the same sources and information. So you can see these, and there is a school of thought that has a lot going for it, that these are predominantly, or at least significantly enough, Samaritans within these units that this extends to giving an advantage to the Samaritan community in any rivalry with Gentiles, but also particularly with the Jewish population. And that therefore, these units are starting out with a considerable hostility towards the Jewish population. That's probably also true of a lot of Gentile communities as well, so they don't necessarily have to be Samaritan. And remember, recruitment is messy. Just because a unit is given this title, it doesn't mean that everybody in it has to come from that particular community. There's a lot more variation, and we just don't know enough about. There aren't diplomas from men from these units that tell us their name and might give us an idea of their place of origin from this period. There aren't inscriptions set up from this period. So much of the information we have about the auxilia comes from those who choose to set up an altar or a tombstone or something like that, and it represents a tiny, tiny fraction of people who served within this branch of the Roman army. So we don't know as much about them as we would like, but it's probably complicated. That's not unusual. Now, there is an incident that comes a little bit later under Claudius, where there has been friction by the Samaritan community, the people of Sebaste, but also so various communities within Samaria, and also these units being involved. Some of the Sebasteni are perceived to be there. So you've got Josephus talks about Claudius wants to chastise the inhabitants of Caesarea and Sebasteni. And Caesarea is very definitely, it's a city, it's on the coast, it's created by Herod the Great as a Gentile city within his kingdom, as a major port. You can see today, looking down through the fairly clear water, the big blocks that were sunk to create an artificial mole, to create a harbour in a coastline that doesn't have natural harbours, and the sheer wealth of it. It's like a lot of Herod the Great stuff. Much of his money is coming through trade and tolls levied on the trade, so he's made good communications through his kingdom to encourage that route to be followed. You've got the big warehouses there. So this is very much a Gentile area, even though it does have significant Jewish communities, and there'll be friction between the two, some of which building up to the outbreak of the rebellion in 66. Because again, it's a vibrant, busy port with lots of opportunities, therefore people go there for work, and it means it does tend to have a fairly cosmopolitan community, but it is officially Gentile. You can have a temple to the divine Augustus, divine Livia, you can have a Tiberium in Caesarea in a way you couldn't build it in Jerusalem because it would upset too many people. So the rules are different. It has the rules of a Gentile city. So you've got recruits coming from there as well. For those abuses they had suffered to him, their madness towards his daughters, his attacks upon the Herods, insults to members of the royal family, and he should remove that body of soldiers that were at Caesarea and Sebasteni with the 5 regiments into Pontus. So you're going to send them to the north coast of Turkey, that they might do their military duty there, and that he should choose an equal number of soldiers out of the Roman legions that were in Syria to supply their place. The word is one that Josephus often uses for legions, but he is fairly loose in this respect. So it might mean regular auxiliaries from, just different areas, different units, rather than ones with connections there. Yet were not those that had had such orders actually removed. They sent ambassadors to Claudius, they mollified him, got leave to abide in Judea still, and these were the very men that became the source of very great calamities to the Jews in after time. So the seeds of the war that began under Florus, once it was then that Vespasian subdued the country, he removed them out of the province, as we shall relate hereafter. So Josephus here implies that the Sebasteni, and again you've got 5 cohorts, cavalry not mentioned, but this is a fairly broad brush description, are local men with local sensibilities, animosities, prejudices, hostile to the Herods, hostile to the Jewish population in general. And you have cases where men from these cohorts, there's one where while they're on guard on the Temple of Antonia and things going on down the Temple of Jerusalem, somebody bends over, bares his bottom, makes the sound of breaking wind, this sort of thing. Another one tears up and burns some scrolls of the Torah when they're doing a search and go into a synagogue. There are moments of provocation. How far this is provocation because these men are from Samaria, perhaps even Samaritans, how far it's because they are other Gentiles who don't particularly like the Jews either, which again is a very real feature of society in this era. Caesarea is not part of Samaria, but it's, again, the population there is often factionalized, and divisions between Jews and Gentiles and others. So this is one of the main pieces of evidence for those arguing that basically all these units are Sebastenian. They're all locally recruited and locally officered. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that they all need to be fully from the area to have those attitudes. It's clearly they identify more with that community, and it seems to be where they're based most of the year. And that's another thing, that units can either be very hostile to the surroundings, but more likely you're settling in. They welcome you. You feel better for that. You treat them better. Therefore, you identify with them more. So the whole thing is a little bit too complicated to explain, or at least to understand fully, for us to say these are definitely men and this is their ethnic background and all these units. Because I say, apart from the one cohort, none of the others are formally attested, but that might be because their names are changed or later on, or they're disbanded at some point because of their role in the rising in 66. So it's difficult to know quite what's going on. Of course, you've also got some evidence from the Book of Acts in particular for other units in the area, not under Pilate, but soon afterwards. Now, Roman army units do seem to have a tendency to stay in one province for a long time. Even if the manpower is sent elsewhere as a detachment, the headquarters, the administration stays in one place, in one province. However, sometimes, what seems like oh yeah, they're there for 20 years, 30 years or more. To scholars, there's plenty of time within that for them to have gone away from their province, from Syria, say, for 5 years and then come back, or for most of the unit to have been away and still to appear in a diploma from 1 year and then another from 25 years later. Doesn't necessarily mean they've been in that one place all the way through. So scholars can be a little rigid in how they interpret the Roman army. So, you have, for instance, the Italian cohort that appears because of the centurion Cornelius that Peter goes to and converts to Christianity with all his household. Now, this seems to be a unit with the title Cohors Italica Civium Romanorum. Not sure about the number. We don't know that. But these are a little odd because they're an Italian cohort with Roman citizenship, specifically there in the title. However, they'd been formed in the aftermath of big disasters faced by Augustus in AD 6, and then particularly the AD 9 disaster in Germany, when manpower was short, and they'd recruited people who would not normally be eligible, including freed slaves, to serve in the regular army. They were granted citizenship, but they were kept distinct from the legions. So they were raised in Italy. They had citizenship, but they hadn't always had it, and they weren't people who would have been allowed to serve in the legions. So they're from a crisis. They're organised as auxiliaries, but they're kept a little bit. So they're slightly, prestigious because after all they are Roman citizens, but they're not legionaries. Now the first recruits were citizens. Inscriptions make it clear that by the 40s AD, these cohorts were recruited from non-citizens, just like any other auxiliary units. So by this time, it's again that first generation that have done their 25 years and have gone by then. They don't need the citizenship on discharge. After that, it isn't a permanent grant that just by joining a unit with this title, you get citizenship. It's more a reminder of the identity of the unit, the pride of the unit, the esprit de corps, that you keep this. This is why we were formed. We served with distinction, so we've remained part of the army. It's a proud tradition, but joining now, you're just going to be an ordinary auxiliary, and you're going to end up with citizenship in 25 years. There's a cohort 2 Italica Civium Romanorum attested in Austria round about the time of the era 4 emperors, the civil war of 69, 70-ish, part of a force drawn from the army of the province of Syria. So that might well be this cohort. So it might well have been that the one Cornelius belongs to is the second cohort. But it's based in Caesarea. Note as well, he has a household, he has a house of his own. Now, units that were in cities like this were often billeted rather than necessarily garrisoned in a fort. But it does rather suggest that this is a man obviously of status. Well, that's not surprising for a centurion, even an auxiliary centurion. But there seems a reasonable chance, because he invites others in, that he's actually part of the local community. So this may be a reflection of a tendency from elsewhere that local elite, local gentry, for want of a better term, are joining the Roman army because it's good for their career, good for their prestige, and commanding units of broadly local men. So even if many of the soldiers actually came from elsewhere, if most of your centurions and officers were from that Gentile or even Samaritan community elsewhere, then their attitudes would probably extend to everybody else within the units. So you have, that's probably the Italian cohort from the Book of Acts, but it's just because, again, there's this link between the Judean garrison and the Syrian garrison. Cornelius does rather sound like a Roman name, so it could be that he's already a citizen, and again, not too uncommon for auxiliary centurions as far as we can tell, but we don't have enough information about them to be too confident in our statistics. So he's a citizen, probably, a man of status, but quite possibly a local, not from Italy or anything like that. The odds are that none of the soldiers are from Italy at all, and that none of them are Roman citizens by this time. So they're just auxiliaries. And again, you've got that mention of the men from Caesarea, the men from Sebasteni. Jerusalem itself seems to have had a garrison of one cohort all the year round, and then at times when the governor came to dispense justice, to hear petitions, all this sort of thing, and also times when it was considered to be, things might be a little bit volatile, like the Passover, the governor would march up with an escort that was probably a substantial part, if not all, of another unit. You have the case where Pontius Pilate marched in at night and his unit carried their standards, which wasn't the normal practice, probably including the emargines, the images of the emperor, and that this caused rioting, protest, and the Roman governor backs down, takes them out. Most of the Roman army, most of the garrisons stationed there are not in Jerusalem itself, most of the time. There's a relatively small presence there in the fortress of Antonia that's adjacent to the temple, and perhaps in some of the other buildings as well. The governor seems to occupy the old Herodian palace, that sort of thing, and you've got these big towers with quite a lot of accommodation in them. That's again another complicated issue, though something interesting for another day. So you have the unit there, but you have most of the army is kept out because again it's too provocative, and also you're doing other things. You're policing the roads, you're chasing bandits, you're enforcing Roman authority, you're going around guarding the tax collectors. You're doing all the things that Roman troops often do. In the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke, you have the centurion whose slave presumably Jesus is said to have cured. In one of the accounts, the local leaders come to ask for this favour because this man's built us a synagogue. It's not entirely clear whether that man was a centurion from one of the Herodian armies, which would make sense in Galilee, or whether he's on detachment from a Roman army unit, a regular unit of the auxilia, or even from further beyond. The army has a great reputation as engineers, as builders. That tends to be particularly associated with the legions, but we don't really know. Now, mentioned earlier, there's something that could raise a slight question mark, that maybe you would get the odd legionary soldier or small numbers of them in Judea under this time, is that when we come to the rebellion in 66, there are catapults, ancient artillery, ballistae, this sort of thing, are in Antonia or in some of the other military installations in Jerusalem that are used by the cohort that's initially holed up and surrounded by the rebellion, but also then they're taken over by the rebels who practice and use them. Now, for a long time, people tended to assume that only the legionaries manned, maintained, and employed artillery. This wasn't something the auxiliaries did. The evidence is actually a little bit rather more ambiguous than that. There is positive evidence for legionaries having artillery, and Vegetius, who's much later, but talks about the legion of the old days, implies that there was almost a standard complement of artillery with each legion. Again, it makes sense. Legion's a big formation, 5,000 strong. It's going to be a major part of any army, and therefore it makes sense that it has these extra, turning it into an all-arms force, that it's got artillery. It's also got lots of people skilled in engineering. Artillery is particularly useful in sieges, can be a bit too cumbersome for ordinary battles, so there were lighter pieces that were used. Therefore, this is the job for the legions. One of the reasons for this idea was also a sort of legacy of British colonial history, where the 1857 mutiny of the armies large parts of the armies in Bengal, the big rebellion and the brutal war that followed then. After that, the Indian army, that's the Indian troops run by the British, were not allowed to have field artillery, only pack howitzers for mountain expeditions, and they had a rifle that was one generation older than the one that was equipping the British troops. This would in fact change during the course of the First World War and afterwards, when military necessity demanded it. But there was that old idea that it made it harder for them to rebel, and therefore some scholars, particularly British scholars working in the early part of the 20th century, thought, well, maybe the Romans are doing the same thing there to make sure the legions keep the auxilia under control. The legions are better organised for large-scale warfare, they've got more specialists, they're better at sieges, and they've got the artillery the auxiliaries haven't. So therefore then this came to the logic of that was, well, the auxiliaries in Jerusalem wouldn't have known how to use this equipment, they wouldn't have known how to use these catapults, therefore maybe some legionaries were detached there and sent down to show them how to do it. I don't think it really holds water. There's the archaeological evidence is rather less clear of where ballista bolts and pieces of artillery turn up, and it's there's some argument for some later auxiliary forts that may even have platforms for mounting artillery on them on the ramparts. I think the odds are it would depend on the auxiliary unit. So yes, probably wasn't standard that every auxiliary unit had some artillery pieces. On the other hand, in certain circumstances, why not? There's no particular reason why they shouldn't, and defending these large installations in Jerusalem, all these big fortifications that Herod had built, and that you might as well keep in good condition and control. You don't want anybody else to have them and get in there. And at forts like Masada and the fortress there and other bases, there is artillery because it's the sensible thing to have in one of these bases. There is no reason why the auxiliaries couldn't operate, maintain, and service these things as legionaries. But it doesn't mean every auxiliary unit do it, just that these units would have the requirement to train some men to do that, and there's no reason they couldn't. So I think that's a fairly weak argument. So on the whole, there is no reason to believe that there were even individual legionaries in Judea, other than on exceptional occasions when the Syrian army intervened. And perhaps occasionally a legionary centurion might go down as a messenger or something like that, or on some task, but it's not normal, and there wouldn't normally be legionary soldiers, which means that any soldiers around Pilate and time of the crucifixion, all this sort of thing, would look like auxiliary soldiers. Now, to an ordinary civilian in the empire, there probably isn't a great deal of difference, and in terms of function and role, there isn't a great deal of difference, but they're not likely to be wearing the segmented armour so beloved of Hollywood. They're not likely to have the rectangular tile-shaped shields, again, so beloved of Hollywood. They're likely to look more like the auxiliaries as they're depicted on Trajan's Column by the reenactment groups, this sort of thing, or as, there are some illustrations that, there is a fair chance as well that when you're performing a job like an execution that you're not wearing full body armour anyway. Not necessarily. You might be in some form of undress just with your weapons belt, perhaps with a shield, perhaps with your spear, but you've got sword and perhaps dagger as well if needed. Hard to know, what was normal? What did the Romans consider normal? How formal did you have to be? To what extent was this idea that soldiers should always be used to wearing their full kit, their full equipment, their helmet, their body armour, the having to go underneath the body armour, all of this all the time, so that they were used to it, and to what extent did people think, well, we're not really doing much actual fighting, let's just be a bit more comfortable, let's be practical. The thing that marked a Roman soldier out in the street was weapons belt with its gladius and possibly pugio on it, and his hobnail boots, and probably his swagger, and the military tunic and cloak and everything helped, but it's that more than the armour. The armour is what jumps out to us, but it's not necessarily the case in the ancient world. So we've just got one more unit we'll talk about very briefly, because later on again in Acts you've got an Augustan cohort appears, and a centurion from this is sent to escort Paul to Rome for investigation and trial. When he seeks judgment there, he appeals to the emperor, as is his right. Quite a few cohorts with the name Augusta occur among the auxilia, but what's interesting is that there's also a cohort Augusta that's attested as the bodyguard of Herod Agrippa II, who's a client king for quite a long period, dies near the end of the 1st century AD. And there's a Greek inscription from around about 84, 89. It's dated to the number of years of the king's reign, but we're not quite sure which year he actually began, so that's the ambiguity of a Lucius Obulnius, centurion of the cohorts Augusta, took care of this work. Year 28 of the great king Marcus Julius Agrippa, the Lord, friend of the Emperor Pius, friend of the Romans. Again, rather suggests he's a Roman citizen. Well, it's an odd, rather old-fashioned Roman name. So you seem to have a cohort here that's organised on the Roman pattern, and but is also serving a client king. Now, whether it's given to him as a gift and it is still part of the regular auxilia, but it's allowed to be, it's a sign of the faith, because again you've got the ambiguity in that the king is a Roman citizen as well as being a Herod, so quite how all this works. And there's an ala cohort 1 Augusta Thracum Equitatis, a mixed cohort of Thracians, is in the same region after Herod's kingdoms dissolve following his death, which suspects the same unit. So again, 41 to 44, much of Judea being given over to Herod Agrippa I, the sort of chum of Caligula and Claudius, appears in the I Claudius series. And it might well have been that a regular unit's given to the Herods then, comes back into the Roman army, goes back to the Herods afterwards, and then comes back into the Roman army. And again, notice that in Acts 27, it's Paul's given to one named Julius, and he's from the Augustan band. So again, Julius might well be a Roman citizen. You have to be a little bit careful because some people who are aspirational in the provinces adopt Roman names in the hope that, the truth will be fulfilled at some point. They can climb that of gaining advantage. But nevertheless, there is a fair chance you've got this unit that shows the sort of bodyguard unit. And if so, that's an interesting, it suggests almost a sign of favour from Herod Agrippa II, who's involved in the trial or the investigation into Paul with Festus. So it looks as if, and then it's said in the book of Acts that Festus and Herod Agrippa had been at odds, but they're reconciled by sort of doing this together. Let's talk to this fella and find out what's going on. That's a sort of olive branch between the two of them. So he's actually sending one of his own men. So this again, these units might well be there earlier. They might not all be 5 cohorts of Sebasteni. We don't really know. Key thing to take is that, as I say, there is not a legion in Judea. There certainly is a legion in Jerusalem in the 30s under Pilate. If a legion intervenes, it's when the governor of Syria intervenes in Judea, and that's a very rare thing and noted in our sources, and it's not talked about at this point. These are auxiliary soldiers. These are not citizens. There is a fair chance that the auxiliary soldiers in Jerusalem at that time were relatively local men from Samaria, perhaps Samaritans, perhaps Gentiles, perhaps from further afield, and that certainly they sympathised more. They were fairly hostile to the wider Jewish population. So this is the army of Judea. It doesn't quite look as we expect it to do, but this is very much part of the regular Roman army. These are Roman soldiers as far as anyone's concerned. It's just they're not legionaries and they're probably not Roman citizens, at least until they've come to the end of their time with the Roman army. So that's it. Again, this has gone on far longer than I intended. That's my way. But hopefully it's of interest just to give some background, some sense of what we know, but also an idea of not just for Judea in this area, but how many variations there were, how complicated and practical the Roman Empire was. Things are made to work. Lots of communities behave in different ways. There are lots of different things going on in different places. So that's it for the moment, and thanks for listening.